All right, ready?
I'm ready.
Here we are, Real Recovery Talk. I am your host, Tom Conrad, and to my left, we've got Benjamin Buttons.
What's happening, everyone?
Aha, threw you for a
He
loop.
did throw me for a loop.
We got Bad Brad in the house. Bad Brad, say what's up.
Hello. What's going on?
All right, so first things first, thank you for watching this episode. Thank you for tuning in on the podcast app. And if you do find value in this content, please don't hesitate to share it with somebody. Everybody needs this info to some degree, I would like to think. And in the end, if you want to reach out to either myself or Ben, you can always email us, Tom at realrecoverytalk.com and Ben at realrecoverytalk.com. And what we will do is we will read your email, we will respond to your email, and we will ask for your phone number. So at that point, we can have a conversation about your specific situation and see if we can maybe be of some assistance, right, Ben?
Correct. And it's fun.
It is fun. I enjoy it. We've gotten a lot of emails from people like across the world, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it's been blowing up lately. All of a sudden,
Yeah.
a lot of correspondence.
Ontario, Canada, a couple people from Australia. Yeah, well, that's about it. Anyways, but thank you for those emails. It lets Ben and I know that this isn't all for nothing, and people are, in fact, actually listening and putting it to good use. Okay, so in this episode, we have somebody that has never been on the show before, Brad, and Brad is somebody that Ben and myself have known for years at this point. It's an interesting episode in the sense of when people enter into treatment, somebody has to pay for this treatment. Generally, the people that end up paying for this treatment are insurance companies. Brad is somebody that deals with and talks to insurance companies on a daily basis. We thought it would be a good idea just to come on and have basic conversation around what insurance companies are looking for, what insurance company, like the questions that they ask us, so on and so forth. So you, the viewer or the listener, can have a better understanding as to how your insurance is utilized when it comes to substance abuse treatment. Did I describe that well?
I think you did a pretty good job. I would also throw out there are programs out there. There's state-funded programs. There's all kinds of grants out there for stuff. The majority of the clients that, at least the treatment centers in South Florida, and so many of them nationwide, do deal with insurance. There's places that are cash pay, and, kind of touching on, I like what you said about, we're going to be talking about what the insurance companies are looking for, because, it can be helpful, but it can also be a lot to navigate too. Say, for instance, somebody came in and just paid cash for a program. There's really no parameters. You can give someone exactly what they need per the therapist, per the clinical team, treatment team. Where with insurance, you kind of have to stay within their parameters, their expectations, which can be good and sometimes can make it very difficult too. But I won't go any further with that. I think Brad's the expert here.
Yeah, so I don't want to, couple ground rules. We don't need to use any insurance names, because we're not like trying to beat them up. They are very difficult to work with. So I think it's safe to say we won't use any insurance names, and we'll just go from there. So Brad, I want to know from your perspective, how in a nutshell would you describe your position? Like, what is it that you do if you're in a coffee shop and you're having a conversation with somebody or a friend of yours, and they're like, Brad, what exactly? Because for us, we say utilization review. You say that to somebody, they're like, what? How would you describe your job to a viewer that really doesn't know, but you do play an integral part in somebody getting sober?
Yeah, definitely. So I do what's called utilization review. I work with insurance companies on managed care, essentially, and I think it can be really confusing as to what utilization review is, what it means, and what it means for individuals when they're seeking out help. So the purpose of utilization review is to it's utilizing benefits from your insurance policy So the insurance companies, as typically with like an outpatient service or like your doctor's visit, won't require an authorization because there's a lot less of a cost associated with that. So insurance companies with treatment, it can be very expensive, and they want to make sure that treatment is actually medically necessary. So they will review a set of principles or guidelines, clinical, that essentially outlines what it means to meet medical necessity, and they use that sort of to determine whether or not they'll pay for treatment. So that's kind of what it is. I think that a lot of people don't understand that process, and it's still kind of hard or difficult to describe that to somebody who doesn't work in this industry. But just think of it as, you need a treatment. Insurance companies, they have to pay out a lot of money for treatment, and 9 times out of 10, they want to try to keep your premium costs and costs for insurance lower. So they're managing your care from essentially the other side of a phone or fax, and they want to make sure that they don't have to pay out excessive funds for people's treatment.
I think you did a good job describing that. I would say, to put it in, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but we all own vehicles. We all take our vehicle to a service department. And when you take your vehicle into a service department, you're talking to a service advisor. That service advisor then takes that car and gives it to the actual technician. The technician looks at the car, goes back to the service writer, and says, this is what it needs. The service writer then comes to the customer and says, hey, you need brakes, you need a transmission flush, so on and so forth. I would say you're more of like the service writer, in the sense of you're going to the insurance companies and saying, hey, I got Frank here, and Frank is seeking treatment. And this is why Frank is seeking treatment. And you give him all the clinicals and stuff like that, the supporting documents to back why the insurance company needs to, in fact, pay for this treatment, correct?
Exactly, yeah.
I think a good way to look at it is to use your example with the automotive. Say, for instance, Brad calls up the insurance and says, hey, they need new brakes. We need to replace these brakes. And the insurance company looks and says, well, he just replaced his brakes 2 months ago. They shouldn't be worn out. And that's kind of a very basic example, but you mentioned the documentation part. A lot of people look at treatment. People that have attended treatment, all they see, for instance, generically is like a group room, some therapists. You just sit around, talk about your feelings, which is not what it is at all. It's so much more, both for the addict and on the administrative side. We're talking about the administrative side today, but like, for instance, it's basically the treatment center's job to advocate for this client. And hence all the documentation, going back to what I was saying about, they just see a group room and therapists, talk about your feelings. What people tend not to realize is how much time goes into documentation. A therapist might meet with the client for 1 hour, and they're probably going to spend 3 or 4 hours typing notes for the insurance company because, in life in general, there's that saying, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So with that being said, like Brad's job is also to help give our therapist guidance on what these clients are looking for, master treatment plans, stuff along those lines. The insurance want, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you want to elaborate on any of it, but like they want end dates. Like the client has master problem number 1, when is this issue going to be addressed by? How are you getting there? Kind of the plans. If you can elaborate on that. I don't know. You say it way better than I do.
Brad,
Sure.
you just to cut in real quick, and just through conversations that we've had, you say something along the lines of the insurance companies are looking more for like a story type situation. Like they want to know from beginning to end kind of what the plan is, so on and so forth. So get into that a little bit, and I think that'll kind of help people understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think with managed care or utilization review in particular, essentially, the insurance company is trying to make a determination on whether or not they should pay for a treatment, making sure that it's medically necessary. And they want to know from start to finish, essentially, a full background of the person. And as much as we think that insurance companies think of clients as a number, because they're just a number to them from a payment standpoint, they really want to get an idea of what's going on with the client, what it is that makes them meet medical necessity, and that could be anywhere from more acute symptomology, or it could mean just historical thing through past trauma. They want a whole picture of what it is to be John Doe, who needs X amount of treatment at at the facilities or this level of care, et cetera. So,
what would you say are some of the biggest hurdles that you run into when it comes to, because it's our job to advocate for the client, and it's also your job to advocate for the client. And we've had this discussion a lot of times, and this is what I said at the beginning. Insurance companies oftentimes can make this very difficult for people to get the care that they need. The insurance companies aren't the ones that are actually doing the therapy. They're not the treatment center. They're not on the front lines and seeing what's going on. They're taking a snapshot of the documentation that we give them and basing their decision off of that, which can be very difficult. Elaborate a little bit on that, some of the biggest hurdles that you find when trying to do that.
I think the idea is that each individual insurance company, and there's many of them out there, I think they all tend to utilize different ways of meeting criteria for each level of care. And so that's where it can become very tricky and very hard because there isn't a set standard. Now, you do have what's called ASAM criteria, and that is more of a standard nationwide. There are other things like Milliman criteria, Locus, and MCG guidelines. And all those different things are used by different insurance companies, and they all have their own version of what it means to essentially meet criteria. So I think the idea is that it's very difficult from a provider standpoint to try to meet the expectations of each insurance company when we're only one person and we're trying to follow essentially one set of guidelines, which is usually ASAM criteria, which is the nationally accredited or looked at criteria for that. And that's not the case. And I think when I say that, I mean, you have to kind of meet the insurance companies where they're at and provide them the information and clinical in that manner. And again, it can be very difficult because it's not so straightforward, which is where I come into play with my experience. And I am familiar with each insurance company's criteria, and I can provide that to them in that manner. Whereas, a therapist, they don't learn those things in school to be able to provide to the insurance company in that way.
Can you do a brief overview? I imagine our listeners probably don't know what a quick breakdown of what ASAM criteria is.
Yeah, definitely. So ASAM is broken down into 6 dimensions, which is kind of going back to touch base on the idea of like a history or historical thing with the client, right? Who's seeking out treatment. So you have ASAM dimension 1, which looks at acute withdrawal potential. So what are the acute symptoms that and the rating for that is usually on a scale of 0 to 4 or 1 to 4 or low, medium, or high risk. And so that looks at with dimension 1, just, symptomology from a dependent standpoint, typically from whatever drug or substance that the person is dependent on.
So you're talking symptoms like vomiting, shakes,
right?
The visible physical withdrawal stuff.
Correct. So vomiting, shakes, seizures, DTs, muscle aches, muscle spasms, racing thoughts, poor concentration, the whole 9. So, and then how levels of care are determined through that sort of set of criteria is based on, the severity of those symptoms. Are they low? Are they moderate? Are they high? And then, that's where we can start looking at placement for level of care at that point.
So if there's 1 through 6 within ASAM, and that person comes in and they are visibly shaking, they're sweating, Maybe their vitals are elevated, their blood pressure is high, they have chills, they're having issues sleeping. Would you then just call the insurance company and say, hey, this is what's presenting. They meet at this ASAM criteria. We are recommending a detox level of care. And then the insurance company then approves it based off that.
Essentially, that's kind of how it works. It's not just so black and white or straightforward as to, hey, somebody's having shakes and they meet in dimension one. It is a multidimensional criteria that they have to meet in each dimension, not just one dimension, to be able to be placed in a certain level of care. So,
what would some of those other dimensions be?
So going on to dimension 2, it talks about biomedical conditions and concerns and comorbidities that, things like hypertension or diabetes. So obviously, if there are co-occurring medical issues and concerns, there's a higher risk associated with certain types of use, abnormal lab values, things like that, so that we can look at, that we can say, okay, well, this is where we gauge this person on this dimension for that. It's really medical is what you're looking at for dimension 2. And so for dimension 3, you start to look at cognitive, behavioral, and emotional distress or barriers and things like that. And you start to look at, okay, well, not just are they having shakes, are the clients having some sort of mental status crisis, or is their mental status not normal? And what does that look like? It could mean issues with ADLs or activities of daily living. So that means like somebody's not able to bathe or their hygiene is poor. Also, how's their mood? Are they highly anxious all the time? Are they severely depressed, etc.? And you can start to look at the mental status there, sort of the history back on, with trauma and things like that, what that looks like for that patient or client. And then for dimension 4, it starts to talk about readiness to change. So what state of change is the client in, and you talk about there's multiple different states of change. And I think you've had that on prior podcasts, I believe.
Yeah.
So refer back to that one to go through all those.
I don't know what episode it is,
but
we'll figure it out and tell you.
But basically, is there ambivalence to getting help? Is there ambivalence to getting, sober? What does their motivation look like to get sober? And so you can start to talk about that, where they're at. Typically, clients at our levels of care are usually in the contemplation state of change. And what that means is they recognize that there's an issue, but they're not unsure, or they're unsure on how to address that situation. And then dimension 5 is really just relapse risk or potential. You start to look at the history of, okay, hey, has there been a prior history of relapse, AMAs from other facilities, or completion of facilities and then still relapsed, just not quite getting it? What's the relapse risk look like? And then dimension 6, you can start to look at the recovery environment. What does the living environment look like? Is it sober? Things like that. And depending on many different factors for all these dimensions, you can start to sit here and say, okay, this is where somebody meets. This is, if there's an active alcoholic or active addict in the home environment actively using, and there's substances all around, it's not going to be a good environment for somebody to return to for recovery, and just puts them at a higher risk, basically. So
the ASAM criteria basically covers that client as a whole, everything from physical to mental, emotional, to their home life. Is there any no real spiritual, huh?
Not necessarily spiritual. I think the idea is that this kind of goes into the next topic I would say that insurance companies like to push is evidence-based treatments. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy, DBT, motivational interviewing, trauma-focused therapies, EMDR, things like that are what's considered evidence-based treatment modalities. And so, there's obviously a spiritual component to it, but it's not necessarily, what's behind what the insurance companies are looking for, essentially. Obviously, when you talk about 12 steps, there is a sense of a higher power and spirituality connection with that. And so I think that insurance companies, it's kind of automatically assumed that that's part of it, but it's not necessarily like, hey, let's take some quartz crystals and rub them on my back and we're going to be sober kind of spirituality. But it is more spiritual in the sense of what is your purpose and what's guiding you. And that can kind of be translated to dimension 4 with the readiness to change and motivation for treatment.
There's so much there. I'm glad we went through the ASAM stuff because I feel like it gives our listeners like a snapshot of actually everything that needs to be addressed at some point in treatment, and the insurance company wants to see that that's being done. Because going back to like the readiness to change, for instance, if you have a client here and the therapist says they're not really doing anything in their one-on-one note, or in the groups they're shut down, and the insurance company turns around and says, well, this client doesn't seem motivated to do any of this. But then like someone like Brad can also understand like, well, they're suffering from severe depression, which has not been addressed. This isn't not a readiness to change. This is something else, or vice versa. This is why like for Tom and I, like Brad, we really look up to Brad in these aspects. Like we consider him an expert. He very good at his job. And at the end of the day, like having somebody like him, what he's doing, in my opinion, is advocating for these clients. Like, essentially it's his job to, in layman's terms, from my point of view, to like fight for days for these people. Because if Brad wasn't good at his job, the insurance company can only take the information as it's being relayed, and they'll turn around and say, well, this person seems good after 10 days. Let's let him go. Where Brad's here we all know somebody can't, I mean, I guess you can, but like it's definitely not ideal to do 10 days of treatment, for instance. Like you want to get someone as much treatment as possible. And that's what Brad is doing. Like he's earning days for these people so that they have the time to fix these things.
One thing I wanted to address is a lot of people don't even realize that they have these benefits available to them. And when they do find out that they have the benefits available, oftentimes they wonder, well, how long? I mean, I get this question all the time. How long am I going to be able to stay in treatment? And that is a very difficult thing to answer. And my go-to answer is, well, so as long as they're an asset to the community, they are meeting all their clinical requirements, they're doing and going above and beyond, what we expect of them, they'll always have a place with us. Puts me in a position of not overcommitting and not undercommitting. But it's difficult for me to have the insurance talk with them. But I do tell them, look, if they're an asset to the community, if they're doing everything that we ask them to do, and they're, exceeding or, doing well in clinical, we're not going to let the insurance companies dictate how would I word this? We're not going to let the insurance companies dictate clinical treatment. And that's unfortunate for us as the facility, because we find oftentimes this person needs more treatment. This person can benefit from more treatment. And the insurance companies say, no, they don't need more treatment. Well, you're not giving the treatment. You are somewhere far away, probably 1,000 miles away. And you're telling us that they're done. We're the ones that take it on the chin and continue to treat them regardless of, what the insurance says. That's in a lot of cases. And there are cases, though, too, that insurance companies give more treatment than we ever expected them to give, So what would you say is a comfortable, like, for listeners that, average, that one that has substance abuse benefits can, in theory, stay in treatment, like just an average type number or something like that?
Honestly, it depends because you start to look at what levels of care you are, looking at. If you're talking about partial hospitalization or PHP levels of care, you typically see about a month in treatment, or anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. I would say is an average on what insurance companies are willing to meet the facilities at with what they're willing to pay for.
Well, let's do this because, again, listeners are, they may have a loved one that's not in treatment right now. They want them to get in treatment. So let's assume they're going to detox and going to do full continuum of care. What do you think based off that?
I would generally expect to be in sort of an intensive setting of treatment for anywhere between at least 1 to 3 months on average, maybe even 4. Depends on the need on the client, though. That's where it's tricky to answer that question. So, until you get a good baseline on what it is the client needs, it's very important. It's very difficult to understand what treatment can look like average, because average in treatment, and I think what we do here as well is not necessarily average. It's really individualized as well, because you can sit here and say, well, average treatment based on textbook can be 1 to 4, 5 months depending on levels of care and things like that. But at the same time, the need for maybe longer might be there, or somebody could be progressing through treatment much faster and it might not be as long. So it kind of touches base back on what is the motivation for treatment? Are you an asset to the community? How willing are you to be, and how serious are you about your recovery? Because also insurance companies like to see that. So they're more willing to pay for treatment when you are wanting to be in treatment. And they sometimes will be more gracious with days and how many days they'll give or how long you're in treatment if you are really serious about it too.
One of the questions we get, Tom and I doing a lot of the admissions intake stuff, is obviously family members want to see their loved one get it their first time. Do you see a difference, just out of curiosity, between people who are doing treatment the first time versus someone that's done it 5 times?
Yes and no. Again, that's also a very hard question to answer, because I think a lot of treatment, where it lies, is kind of individualized to the person. How motivated are they? It doesn't matter how many times you're in treatment. If you don't want to be sober, you're never going to get sober, no matter how much treatment it is that you get. You can have a year or 2 years in treatment. And really, at the end of the day, if you don't want to get sober and you still plan to use, you're going to go out and use, you know what I mean? If you still have those reservations. Now, if you're really serious about it, or maybe something happened, maybe you hit that rock bottom, the 3rd treatment in, that 3rd treatment could be it. It could be the first treatment. I think you have to be a little bit more realistic, though. First time treatment is not necessarily something that is probably gonna be the most successful. I think the first time treatment is really understanding and finding out what it is that you want, and sobriety is not just not using substances. It's about rediscovering yourself and finding, what it is it means to be you as a person. And I think that, that can be after 1 treatment, but it likely can be after more treatments. You know what I mean? It just depends on the person.
Yeah, that we see that all the time with people. I mean, we have some that, do treatment once and for whatever reason they get it. And that was me. I did treatment 1 time. And for whatever reason, I quickly understood that this life without alcohol is going to be far better than life with, And when I came to that realization, and it didn't take long, that was it. I had bought in at that point. You got somebody over here like Ben. How many times you go to treatment?
I can't even put a number on it, because sometimes I was like in a hospital detox setting. Other times, like if I got in trouble, I'd be in just an intensive outpatient. I didn't necessarily go detox all the way through every time. I lost count. And do you count the psych wards? I don't know. But, to just kind of hit it home for the listeners too, like I'm glad Tom mentioned my case. because just because I've gone to treatment so many times, willingness to change, like I want to throw it out there just for, listeners that may be concerned. Like I really did want to be sober. I can't even explain why I relapsed like even to today. In my mind, I did to the best of my ability with every treatment I was in. I really did. Like I gave 100% effort, ended up relapsing. And that's why I asked that question, whether or not, the insurance companies see a difference, because it did take me that many times. Some people it doesn't. For me, it didn't mean that I didn't want it. And I don't want listeners to get discouraged if their loved one doesn't get it their first time. It doesn't mean that they don't care or have lack of interest in being sober, or don't like the idea of it. Like the desire might be there, but somebody may need as many times as I did.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
I definitely think that you can look at treatment as a sort of not. I kind of want to use the example as a monetary thing. It's an investment, right? Your treatment attempts you can get lucky on your first time, and you can hit the lotto when you reinvest money or something like that, right, into the stock market. And you can become super rich, but it generally, you would need to continue to reinvest or to continue to add funds to grow. And I think what that looks like, you can make it your first time if you really want to. But what it is, and why I bring that sort of analogy up is, treatment is something that you will learn valuable resources, skills, ways to stay sober. And as long as you try your hardest and you follow those rules and you identify what's helpful for you, what's not helpful for you, and you take it seriously and you use that, you have a higher chance of remaining sober. At the end of the day, the reality is as addicts, it's not something that it's so straightforward, and it's super individualized. So, going to treatment one time for one person might not be the case, or going to treatment 15 times still might not be the case. But it's really up to the person on how they choose to utilize the skills that they've learned, and how do they want to reinvest those skills essentially into their lives, into them.
Put it very well, Brad. Well, listen, for what it's worth, and I know we're running out of time here. I don't know, considering you don't ever see any of these clients ever, you obviously do all of your work from an office and you never have interaction with any of the clients, but rest assured you play a very integral part in these people, in their recovery and in their sobriety. So I just want you to know that, it makes our jobs like, it's all full circle. If we didn't do our jobs well, you couldn't do your job well. If you couldn't do your job well, we couldn't do our job well. And in the end, we are all doing our jobs well for the betterment of that client.
Right.
And, the insurance companies, listen, it's easy for us to throw stones at them, but we're not the insurance companies. I could only imagine if I was the owner of an insurance company or the board of directors, and I got Frank over here that's in his 72nd treatment. At what point do you draw the line?
Right. What's going to be different?
Yeah, what's going to be different? But, fortunately, we don't deal with that a whole lot, at least here. So, Ben, you have any final thoughts?
No, I don't. I like I said earlier, Brad is a wealth of knowledge. He really does help. I'll speak for myself, helps me do my job better. There's a lot of times I call him, I'm like, well, what do I do with this case, this situation? Yeah. How do we make this happen for the best outcome of the client? And he's always spot on.
Insurance companies aren't always the enemy. Of course, they do try to obviously manage care and save them as much money as possible by not authorizing treatment where they can. But I think the idea for me and what I do is really to help bridge that gap between the provider and the insurance company as sort of a liaison and an advocate for our clients too, because, at the end of the day, what I do is for the clients. It's not for the insurance company. Really, it's not for money. It's really to help people get sober, and what's the best way that I can do it with the cards that are drawn at this point.
Yeah.
You don't have to dive deep into this for sake of time, but yes or no is all right. But correct me if I'm wrong. Like we've talked about it, you've actually developed relationships with a lot of these case managers at this insurance companies. Like, oh, it's Brad, you know?
Yeah, most definitely. Because I think at the end of the day too, like I'm not trying to, I don't want to have a bad relationship with the care managers at the insurance companies or the insurance company in general. And quite frankly, I go the extra length very frequently to speak to supervisors regarding certain cases, because at times I think the message gets lost from what they're trying to do on their end as well. Although I don't do direct care with clients, you know, the insurance company is even the next party involved after me that doesn't deal with direct care with clients. And so I think the idea is that these care managers are so attuned to trying to save money sometimes that they lose sight of what it is that they're actually doing. So, you know, that's where I come into play and I say, listen, Susan, I understand that you're trying to do a job. I understand that you're trying to save money, but I'm telling you now, this person is making changes. This person wants this. Please authorize more time so we can help them reach their goals and help them help themselves, essentially. You know what I mean? And just kind of looking at it that way, where we're working with the insurance company, because, you know, I'll be upfront with them sometimes. And I say, do you want to see them back in a higher level of care again, detox in 3 weeks? And then you guys have to pay even more money out when you could just, you know, help give a little bit more time now. You know what I mean? So it's kind of looking at that perspective and saying, you know, oh yeah, well maybe that is right. Maybe after this is the 5th treatment, if we listen to the facility this time, maybe we will be able to save money, because that's what they're ultimately trying to do. And some insurance companies are receptive to that and some aren't. And, you know, that's kind of what we have to deal with it sometimes, but it'd
be interesting to have somebody conduct like a study on, you know, how much money an insurance company loses over the course of a year versus how much they would save if they just like gave unlimited, you know, treatment or something. I don't know, some sort of study to where they could actually like look and say, okay, this was unlimited treatment. This was, you know, managed treatment and we denied time, yada, yada, yada. And this is the last thing I want to say, because a lot of companies have actually done this, and this is a total rabbit trail, but with vacation time, there's a lot of companies out there, corporate companies that say, Brad, you have unlimited vacation here. What do you think that person does? They don't want to abuse that. You know, so they have found that people actually take less vacation if you give them unlimited vacation days than if you you get 3 weeks or 4 weeks, so on and so forth. If you give them 4 weeks, they're going to take 4 weeks. You give them unlimited, they may take 12 weeks, but chances are they're only going to take 2 or 3, you know? Probably not a good analogy, though, the more I think about it. Because if you tell a drug addict, listen, you can go to treatment as long as you want for as many times as you want, they might not get sober. So let's not use that analogy.
Well, and again, I think it goes back to the individual. You know, I think it can apply in certain instances where it depends on whether or not, are you serious about treatment? Are you going to be working on those barriers and those hurdles as you go through treatment to be able to utilize that time? Or are you just going to sit there and glide through treatment and not do anything and not do any work and just use the facility or, you know, sober housing as a housing component, and that's just it? And, you know, I think that's where it's hard, because insurance companies try to avoid that as much as possible. But at the same time, if we are advocating as best as possible for our clients to sit here and say, hey, you know, so-and-so really wants this is what they're doing to make changes. And then at every time that we speak to them for any sort of reviews or medical necessity review and say, hey, like motivation in Dimension 4 has changed. This wasn't working and we changed it up, and this is what we're doing now to continue addressing these problems. I think that, you know, that's a good way to look at how treatment planning is addressed and how much insurance companies are willing to provide.
I think we did a good job here, Brad. I think you did a good job explaining the insurance side of things and kind of what goes into that. And glad you were willing to do that.
Very unique episode. That's what I think's cool about it.
Yeah.
Fresh.
There's a lot to it. And, there's a lot more that goes into it than most people see, even at the facility. So it can become very nuanced and very confusing for families. I can tell you, I even have issues with my own insurance policy, and I do this for a living on the day to day. And so understanding my own insurance policy sometimes can be mind boggling. But at the end of the day, we just have to do our best, right?
That's it. All right. That's it. Good?
We're good.
All right. Thank you for watching this episode of Real Recovery Talk. Thank you for listening on the podcast app. Again, if you want to reach out to myself or Ben, you can always email us, Tom at realrecoverytalk.com and Ben at realrecoverytalk.com, and we will get back to you momentarily and we'll ask you for your phone number. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is help you turn your mess into your message. We'll see you later.
Hey, bye, Brad.